Welcome to Eternal Elements Learning Podcast brought to you by Atyasa Online. These podcasts are a part of the audio certificate programs on Atyasa Online. You're free to take these podcasts on your desired portal also, should you only wish to learn on the go. Thank you so much for engaging on these podcasts, and you can connect with the author on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Hi, this is Niket Karajagi from Eternal Elements brought to you by Atyasa Online. We're talking about strategy. We've completed our grand strategies. Therefore, it's important now to relook at the entire strategy formulation process because we're going to talk about objectives in this podcast. I said in the beginning of the season that every strategy formulation process starts with the company mission and the vision. After that, we scan the external environment, where we scan the remote environment, the industry environment, and the operating environment. Alongside, we also scan our internal analysis, because we have to look at the internal processes of the organization also. We talked about the popular tool of SWOT. And then we said that after we do our external environment scanning and we do our internal analysis, we come into strategic analysis and we start making choices. That means we zero down on certain options. These options give rise to the grand and generic strategies, something that we talked about in the earlier podcast. In this podcast, we're also saying that the strategic analysis and choices, along with the generic and grand strategies, give you long-term objectives. These long-term objectives and the strategic analysis and choices together also determine the impact of generic and grand strategies. Therefore, long-term objectives and grand strategies and generic strategies work parallel because they come from the strategic analysis and choices. However, there is an interdependence between generic and grand strategies and long-term objectives because long-term objectives, like I said, are derived from the strategic analysis and choices, but they must also be aligned to the generic and grand strategies. So what are these long-term objectives? These are primarily the goals and the outcomes, which are business outcomes that the organization looks for over a period of 5 years, sometimes 3 years. We're living in the world of VUCA, and when we're living in the world of VUCA, the long-term objectives also tend to get crunched, but obviously they're not for the particular year, they're definitely beyond the year. These objectives can be branding, it can be about technology, it can be about investments, it could be about how are we going to satisfy our customers, it could also be about competitive advantages and the core competence that we want to build. So it's primarily about long-term. Now, when we decide on these long-term objectives, objectives by their own meaning is tactics which are used to achieve strategic goals. Now, if long-term objectives are about 3 to 5 years, that means they have to cascade down to short-term objectives which are for the particular year. Short-term objectives are measurable outcomes which are intended to be achieved in 1 year or less. Now, these short-term objectives further tend to cascade down into functional objectives because if at an organization level we have short-term objectives, then obviously each of the functions also needs to come up with their strategies for the year. And when these objectives are determined at the level of functions, they become functional objectives. These are the detailed statements and means of activities that a function would carry out to accomplish everything about competitive advantage. But this is all about short term. So if the competitive advantages are to be built over a period of time, we also cascade it down into milestones for an individual year. Now, when you have short term objectives, which are also cascading down into functional tactics, then you also have to empower your people to carry out those objectives. And therefore, empowerment is the act of allowing individuals and the team to make decisions and implement them. They also give rise to policies because if you're looking at the long-term objectives and short-term objectives, they come into policies. Now, typically managers tend to take two kinds of decisions. One, they take decisions which are programmed. Programmed decisions are standard operating procedure. That means every time a new decision is taken, it converts into a process, and therefore it becomes a programmed decision. So when you're taking a decision for which there is no earlier data or there is no earlier precedence available, that becomes a non-programmed decision. But after that decision is taken, it converts into a programmed decision. And policies typically are broad decisions which are repetitive in nature, and they help the managers connect with these standard operating procedures, which are the policies of the company, and therefore the decision making becomes very easy. And therefore, when we put all this together, we are actually talking about the implementation of the strategy. So when it comes to implementation of the strategy, what are we talking about? We're saying that the strategic analysis and choices gives rise to generic and grand strategies and long-term objectives. The long-term objectives and generic and grand strategies then come into the realm of implementation. And when they come into the realm of implementation, we talk about three things. One, the short-term objectives. Two, we talk about functional tactics. Three, we talk about policies. Short-term objectives, all activities that we are supposed to close by the end of the year. Functional tactics are all the achievements that a function has to carry out in terms of its activities for the year, so it goes function-wise. And then the policies are primarily the standard operating procedures that an organization gets into, which are primarily programmed decisions which are recorded. These three become the implementation procedure for the strategy implementation stage of the entire strategy formulation process. Thank you very much. This is Niket Karajagi signing off from Eternal Elements. I spoke to you about objectives and I spoke to you about implementation of strategies in this podcast. I shall see you in the next podcast, where we shall start talking about organization structures which help us to control the strategy, and therefore we are now moving into the process of the control of strategies, and therefore we are now getting into the realm of management control. Thank you very much. This is Niket Karajagi signing off from Eternal Elements. I shall see you in the next podcast. Bye for now.